Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree. It's time for another video game buyer's guide, and today we're talking about the ill-fated but underappreciated Sega CD. Now, much like the 32X, you could view the Sega CD and its software library as just an accessory to the Sega Genesis, and therefore its games are just an extension of the Genesis library. This is a perfectly valid perspective to take. However, the system did get quite a few, I would say, standalone iterations separate from an attachment or add-on to the Genesis. Something the 32X never got. And so that kind of does mean you can access the Sega CD library without needing to own a Genesis. In some cases, the hardware is compatible with Sega CD and Genesis, so it's technically two consoles in one, and in some cases, it's just the Sega CD software that you can play. And I'll try to point that out as best as I can, but I'm going to be honest, there's some stuff I don't know about this thing. There's so much. Now, the Sega CD was originally an attachment to the Model 1 Sega Genesis. So the very first hardware was the Model 1 Sega CD, which had a tray, a front-loading tray. You would push the button and it would load that way, and it looked like a stereo system that you would put on your, in your living room with your home theater system or your home stereo setup. Your hi-fi or whatever they used to call it back in the day. The Model 2 Sega Genesis, the slimmer redesign, also got a slimmer redesign of the Sega CD as well, which is technically compatible with the Model 1 Genesis, technically, but it does require an attachment that doesn't always come with the used Sega CDs that you buy off of eBay and secondhand, so you have to look out for that. And then the third option that Sega themselves produced was the CDX. The CDX is a portable Discman looking device that is basically doubles as a portable CD player, but also works as a Sega CD and a Sega Genesis. And similar to the 3DO was manufactured by multiple companies, Sega did license out the Sega CD technology to other companies, most notably JVC and their XI, which was known as the Wonder Mega, I believe, in Japan. And then there was another machine that was a Laserdisc, very expensive, high-end Laserdisc video game player. I believe it was called the Laser Active or something like that. That had cartridge slots for expansions. And one of the expansions it had allowed it to play Sega CD games. Now, modern retro clones, by and large, are cartridge-based. Therefore, you can't really play Sega CD software on most modern retro clones. Now, I do believe there may be one or two CD-ROM options, but I believe that they're similar to the machine I just described, where you basically buy the base machine and then you buy modules for it. I don't know a whole lot about these in terms of like functionality or compatibility or longevity. I do know that Model 1 Sega CDs tend to break down, and Model 2 Sega CDs tend to be, they also tend to break down because they were made of inferior parts to keep the cost down. I don't know much about the laser active component stuff. I don't know if those are very viable. I've never seen an XI in the wild in my entire life, or a CDX. But I also can't imagine that they would have a long shelf life. So going the authentic retro method is likely to be expensive. Because not only do you have to buy a functional Sega CD unit, in most cases you also have to buy a functional Sega Genesis unit as well. And I do believe the Sega CDs Model 1 and Model 2 are only compatible with the Model 1 and Model 2 Genesis, not the Jalico Genesis 3. So keep that in mind. Also, they're not compatible with the Nomad, understandably, because it's a handheld device. Now, fortunately, most of your modern Genesis emulators can also emulate Sega CD because it's the same hardware. The Sega CD was literally just a second Motorola chip in it with a sound chip and to help read the CD audio, and that's basically it. So if you can emulate the Genesis chip, you can very easily emulate the Sega CD chip. So as far as that goes, that's your best option for playing Sega CD software, vintage retro Sega CD software to this day. And fortunately, if you go the route of buying physical discs, like actual pressed retro discs, those are fully compatible with the emulators. Now, what's mind-boggling is the Saturn cannot play Sega CD software. The reason why this is mind-boggling is because the chips, the CPU that powers the Genesis and the CPUs that power the Sega Saturn are fully compatible. Well, the Genesis chip is in the Saturn, and the SH2s are fully compatible with Genesis software. They were very easily able to port Genesis software to the Saturn with very little effort. So it wouldn't have taken hardly anything at all for the Sega Saturn to natively play Sega CD software, yet it doesn't, for whatever reason, which is mind-boggling. As far as exclusive software, which, okay, I'm going to be upfront with you, there's not a lot of quality games on the Sega CD. It was really hard for me to do a top 25 Sega CD games. And now, I'm coming at it from, I was a kid when the Sega CD came out, so I was, at the time, impressed with the FMV games, and when I had a Sega CD, I did play and enjoy some of the FMV games. So I put the ones I enjoyed on that list, because it's my list, obviously. But they're not for everybody. And most of your FMV games that you can get on the Sega CD, you can get elsewhere. 3DO, PC, PlayStation, Saturn, 32X. There's, so many other ways to play those games. So the FMV games, ironically, as the worst games in the software library, by and large, have been better preserved than most other games. Now, a lot of your Sega CD games are a mixture of ports from the Genesis. So, like, if a game was made for the Genesis, a Sega CD version was made. And most of the time, it may be enhanced with some FMV cutscenes and some CD quality audio. Maybe it has some enhanced graphics, but not always. Maybe it has some bonus content, but not always. And then you got a lot of ports of, like, popular arcade games and PC games from the time. A Star Wars TIE Fighter game, or Rebel Assault, or whatever it's called. Mortal Kombat, NBA Jam, Primal Rage, games like that. Final Fight was another one. But and Samurai Showdown, I have to mention it. Even those usually don't look much better than their Genesis counterparts. Sometimes, or most of the times, but not always. You would assume so, but not always. But most of the time, they have CD quality audio. In the case of Mortal Kombat, the graphics are identical. It is the Genesis version. It's literally the Genesis version. You get the FMVs added back, and you get the music video, and that's it. It's identical. There's no enhancements to the graphics whatsoever. Just maybe some additional sound effects or sampled voices, and that's it. Most of your other arcade ports to the Sega CD, again, they're not going to be that much better than their Genesis counterpart, if at all. The third type of game that you can find on the Sega CD that's not a port, because I'm counting the FMV games largely as ports, but I've also mentioned the FMV games. You have some semi-exclusives, games that were made for the Sega CD. There's a Terminator, there's a Power Rangers, Jurassic Park. There's a platformer about a super dog, Wonder Dog or something like that. And there's a platformer with a character that's a pencil. But for the most part, by and large, these games are not great. They're just generic mascot-style 2D platformers. You know, there's nothing spectacular or amazing about any of them. The Sega CD does have a handful of gems, hidden gems. They've got some great shoot-em-ups. They've got some good 3D style games. They got a couple of first-person shooters, neither of which I will say are great. They've got some, the Terminator game is pretty good. Sonic CD, Mortal Kombat CD, those are all pretty good. And then you've got stuff like the RPGs, like the Shining Force and Lunar games. There's 2 Lunar games, and there's, I believe, 1 Shining Force game. There might be 2 or 3 other RPGs, but I didn't explore the Sega CD library that much when I had one, nor since then. I mean, I'm familiar with it, like looking at Wikipedia and watching YouTube videos and stuff like that, but I haven't personally played that many Sega CD games because, frankly, every time I do, the game is overhyped. None of them are ever as good as people say they are. So a lot of times when you say hidden gem on the Sega CD, what you really mean is you found a functional game. And that's a low bar. That's a pretty low bar. Just having a functional game qualifies that game as a hidden gem on the Sega CD, because most of the games you're going to come across are really awful FMV games or really crappy ports of Genesis or arcade games. Not a lot of great stuff on the Sega CD. It's not all terrible. There were only about 125 to 150 games released for the Sega CD, depending on how you count games, because some of them are just interactive software. Some of them are educational software. So it's up to you whether you count those as games or not. However, even if you do go the physical Sega CD route, I have good news for you. You obviously, if you have the money or you want to buy physical discs, that's an option. However, the Sega CD has no copy protection at all, and it has no region coding at all. So you could download ISO images of any game from Europe, Japan, or North America, burn it to a CDR, pop it in your disc, and if you did it right, it should play. So as far as accessing the Sega CD software, that is another option. Now, again, outside of the aforementioned FMV games that do exist on the PC, and some of the arcade games like Samurai Showdown and Mortal Kombat that have been modernized and released on modern consoles, there's not a lot on the Sega CD that has been preserved, we'll say. Not a lot of it has been reissued or remastered. Sonic CD has been released a few times. Lunar, Silver Star Story, and Eternal Blue were both remastered and enhanced for the Sony PlayStation, but I don't think they've ever been reissued since then. Now, again, I'm not 100% on this, but that's my understanding. So a lot of the games you're going to want to play on the Sega CD, unfortunately, are still tied to the Sega CD. So you're either going to have to pay an outrageous fortune to get physical copies and the hardware, or pirate it one way or the other. Either download the ROMs and play them through the emulator, or burn the ROMs to a CD-R and play them on physical hardware if that's the way you want to go. It's up to you. As far as collecting for the Sega CD, there's a lot. Like I said, there's 3 different hardware units that were manufactured by Sega themselves, and at least 2 fully compatible hardware units that were made by third parties that I know of. There might be other stuff that I don't know. I know 3DO has a graphics card that you can plug into your PC and it lets you play 3DO software on your Windows computer. I don't know if there is a similar device that lets you do that with a Sega CD or not. I'd like to know if there is. That would be awesome. But as far as Sega CD collecting goes, I'm sorry to say your best bet is emulation. Either downloading the ROMs and burning them yourself, or just downloading the ROMs and playing them on the emulator. Stay cool.